Envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home from work. Not mailed, hand-delivered, my name written in my brother's handwriting on the front. Theo never hand-delivered anything. He used text messages and group chats and the occasional drunk voicemail on holidays. A physical envelope, in my kitchen, meant he'd use the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. I stood there in my coat for a long moment before I picked it up. Inside was a printed screenshot of a conversation between my mother and his wife, Denise. The final line of it was highlighted in yellow marker. Denise had written, "She's going to find out anyway when the estate gets filed. Better she hears it from family than from a stranger with paperwork." My mother had replied, "Let her find out however she finds out. Some things are better left where they are." I read it twice. Then I folded it back along the original crease and put it in my jacket pocket and went to make coffee, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Let me back up. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house that looked functional from the outside. 2-car garage, good school district, the kind of neighborhood where people waved when they drove past. My parents, Vivian and Howard, had been married for 34 years before my father died of a stroke 18 months ago. To the outside, they were stable. Solid. That word people use when they mean nothing dramatic happened that we could see. Inside, it was more complicated. My older brother Theo was the kind of son who filled a room, loud, confident, quick with a joke, the one who called our mother every Sunday and showed up to fix things and was generally considered by all extended family to be the responsible one. I was quieter. I went to Ohio State, studied accounting, moved to Columbus after graduation, and built a life that was organized and self-sufficient, and probably interpreted by everyone as distant. I wasn't distant. I just stopped needing things from people who weren't able to give them. My father was the exception. Howard Aldridge was a deliberate man. He listened the way most people don't, fully, without preparing his response while you were still talking. He remembered small things. When I changed jobs 3 years ago, he sent me a card in the mail, not a text. A card with 2 sentences inside in his actual handwriting. "You've always known what you were doing. Trust yourself." I kept it in the drawer of my nightstand, and I still have it. When he died, something structural went out of the family. There was no ceiling anymore on the low-level tension between Theo and me, which had always been there, but had always, while our father was alive, stayed below a certain point. Howard wouldn't allow it past that point. After he was gone, I felt the shift within weeks. It was small at first, Theo making comments at the memorial that positioned him as the primary grieving child. Denise mentioning, twice, that they'd been the ones handling everything in the final months of Dad's illness, as if I hadn't driven up to Dayton every other weekend. My mother going quiet whenever I was in the room in a way she didn't go quiet with Theo. I cataloged these things the way I catalog everything. Accurately, without drama, filed away in a part of my mind labeled "Figure this out later." The envelope moved it to "Figure this out later." I called Theo the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting me to call. I asked him why he'd left it instead of just talking to me. He said he'd tried to talk to her and she'd shut it down. Said he didn't know how to say it out loud to my face, and thought I deserved to know before the estate proceedings started. I asked him what, specifically, I deserved to know. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Dad found something out about 2 years before he died. Something about you, about before you were born. He said he'd asked Mom about it and she'd told him it wasn't what he thought and he'd let it go. But apparently he didn't fully let it go because Denise found something in his files when she was helping Mom organize the house." "What kind of something?" I said. "A letter," Theo said, "from someone named Robert Castillo, addressed to Dad. About you." I didn't know that name. I told Theo that. "I know," he said. "That's kind of the point. I'm 31 years old. I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Columbus. I'm good at my job because I am precise and because I do not find paperwork frightening. I say this because what happened next required both of those qualities in a way I wasn't prepared for. I drove to Dayton that Saturday, not to confront my mother. I didn't have enough information to confront anyone, but to see the letter myself. Theo had photographed it on his phone. He showed it to me at his kitchen table while Denise took their daughter to the park, I think to give us space. Robert Castillo had written the letter 14 years ago. He was writing, he said, because his conscience had been bothering him for a long time, and because he was sick. He mentioned a diagnosis, serious, and he didn't want to die with the weight of something he participated in. He wrote that he and my mother had been involved briefly in the spring before I was born. He wrote that he had always suspected, based on timing and a photograph he'd seen of me as a child, that I might be his daughter. He wrote that he was not asking for anything. He was not threatening anything. He wrote, I understand this is not my decision to make, and I respect whatever you choose to do. But I felt you deserved to know that I know, and that I have kept this to myself for 30 years, and that I am sorry for the position it has put you in. My father had written 2 words at the top of the letter in pencil, the way he noted things when he was processing them. He'd written, still her. That was it. Still her. I sat at Theo's kitchen table for a long time after he put his phone away. I wasn't shattered. That's the part I keep returning to, even now, because I think people expect devastation, and what I felt was closer to the sensation of a room finally making sense after you've been trying to figure out the furniture arrangement for years. The distance I'd always felt in that house, the specific, particular way I had never quite fit into the shape of my mother's expectations, some of it settled into place, not all of it, but some. I drove home to Columbus without stopping at my mother's house. I requested a DNA test the following week. A direct-to-consumer kit mailed results nothing dramatic. I did it the way I would handle any question I didn't have enough data on. I mailed it, and I waited, and I went to work, and I did my job, and I did not tell anyone except my best friend Laurel, who held the information with the same steadiness she holds everything. The results came back on a Thursday evening in early October. I was eating dinner at my kitchen table when the notification came through. Paternal line, no match to the Aldridge family genetic profile. Strong suggested match to a family cluster associated with the surname Castillo, primarily located in New Mexico and the greater Phoenix area. I ate the rest of my dinner. I washed the dish. I called Laurel. Then I called my mother. She answered, sounding like she'd been awake already, which told me she'd been waiting for this call for longer than 2 weeks. Possibly for 31 years. I told her what the results said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I always loved you the same. I told her I believed her. I also told her that wasn't actually what I called about. I asked her directly, did Dad know? She said, he found out 2 years ago. He got a letter. I said, I know about the letter. I'm asking if he knew before that. Another silence. Longer this time. She said, I think he always wondered. He never asked me directly until the letter came. When he did ask, I told him it was complicated. He said to me, I remember exactly what he said. He said, she's my daughter, Vivian. I don't need it to be more complicated than that. I held the phone and looked at my kitchen counter and didn't say anything for a while. She said, I should have told you. I know that. I want you to know that I know that. I told her I needed some time and I ended the call. The estate proceedings began the following month. My father had not had an enormous estate by any measure. The house in Dayton, a retirement account from 30 years at an engineering firm, a small investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy. The attorney handling it was a woman named Patricia Okafor, and she had a manner that suggested she had heard everything and was not surprised by any of it. Theo and I were listed as equal beneficiaries in the version of the will that had been filed with the probate court. My mother had a life estate in the house, meaning she could live there until she passed, after which it would be sold and split between Theo and me. This was all standard. This was what we had both assumed. What neither of us had assumed was that there was a second document, Patricia Okafor mentioned it at the initial meeting with the kind of careful neutrality that attorneys use when they know something is about to land hard. She said my father had filed a letter of instruction with his estate documents 18 months before his death, roughly 6 months after the letter from Robert Castillo arrived. The letter of instruction was not legally binding in the same way a will was, but it had been written and notarized and attached to the file, and she felt obligated to read it in full to both parties. Denise was not present. She'd offered to come. Theo had told her to stay home, and I understood from that later that he'd already known something additional was coming and had wanted to handle it between the two of us. My father had written the letter in the fall of the year before he died. His handwriting was familiar to me from birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter growing up, from the card in my nightstand. Hearing it read aloud by someone who hadn't known him was a strange thing. But the words were him. Entirely him. He wrote that he had learned information that had shaken him briefly and ultimately changed nothing. He wrote that both of his children were his children in every way that he understood the word. He wrote that he was aware that Theo had, over the preceding year, been in contact with the estate attorney on multiple occasions without the knowledge of the other beneficiary, me, and that several of these conversations had involved suggestions about restructuring the distribution to account for, in Theo's words, the question of biological legitimacy. My father wrote that he had found this deeply disappointing. He wrote that he was not changing the distribution in response to Theo's efforts. He was, however, amending the life insurance beneficiary designation, which he had the legal right to do at any time without a new will, to name me as the sole beneficiary. The policy was worth $240,000. He wrote, "I am doing this not as a punishment, but as a correction. Theodore has had advantages that were not always visible as advantages. This is an attempt to account for some of that." He wrote one more thing. At the end, in a paragraph that Patricia read more quietly than the rest, "To my daughter, if she is reading this, and I hope she is, I want her to know that I spent 31 years watching her figure things out on her own that she should not have had to figure out alone. I am proud of her in a way I was not always able to say out loud. I regret that. She knows what she is doing. She always has." I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Patricia gave me that moment without comment, which was one of the kindest things anyone did for me that year. Theo was quiet for the entire reading, not the guilty kind of quiet, the kind that is processing. On the drive to the parking garage afterward, he said, "I want you to know I didn't think it was legitimate. What Denise suggested. I got scared when the letter came out. I didn't handle it right. I asked him what specifically he had said to the estate attorney. He told me. It was worse than I'd expected and not as bad as it could have been. He hadn't tried to cut me out entirely. He'd asked questions, floated possibilities, tested the ground. My father had found out through the attorney himself, who had apparently felt obligated to flag the contact as a conflict. I told Theo I needed time with it. He nodded. He said, "I know." We stood in the parking garage, and there was a long pause that was the size of everything we hadn't said to each other in the last year and a half. Then he said, "He wrote still her on the letter." Mom told me that. I didn't know what it meant until today. I told him I'd figured it out. The life insurance payout was processed 8 weeks later. I set a portion of it aside immediately in a high-yield savings account. This is not a romantic detail, but it is an accurate one, and this is my story, so. The remainder I divided. Some went to paying off the last of my graduate school loans. Some went to a down payment account I'd been building slowly for the past 3 years. I had always assumed that house would come later than it needed to. It no longer needed to come as late. I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon in December, 3 months after the estate reading. Not because I'd fully worked through everything. Because I had decided that waiting until I'd fully worked through everything might mean never calling. She answered on the first ring. I told her I wasn't ready to pretend nothing had happened. But I wasn't ready to make it permanent either, she said. I understand. I said, I need you to actually tell me, not the version where you circle around it, the actual version. So she told me, about the year she and my father had gone through a difficult stretch. She didn't over-explain it, and I didn't ask her to. And the months that followed, and finding out she was pregnant, and telling my father the full truth before I was born, and him saying the same thing he'd said to her when the letter arrived 30 years later, nearly word for word, "She's mine." That's where we start. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because I didn't know how to explain it without it changing how you saw him. And I couldn't risk that." I thought about the card in my nightstand. "You've always known what you were doing. Trust yourself." I told her I understood. I told her I was angry anyway. Both things were true. She said, "I know. I'm sorry. I mean that." I believe she did. Theo and I have had 3 real conversations since the estate was settled. Not the surface kind, the kind where you talk about his daughter's soccer and my apartment and whether mom seems okay. The actual kind, where something that matters gets said. They've been uncomfortable and necessary, and I think we're in the early stages of building something that functions better than what we had before. I don't know. I'm not a person who makes predictions about things I can't measure yet. I found Robert Castillo's obituary while doing some research a few weeks after I learned his name. He had died 6 years ago in Albuquerque. He'd been a high school biology teacher for most of his career. He had a daughter and 2 grandchildren listed in the obituary. I looked at it for a long time. I didn't feel much, and then I felt something I couldn't name, and then I closed the tab. I'm not looking for another father. I had one. He filed a letter of instruction with his estate attorney and amended a life insurance policy and wrote 2 words in pencil at the top of a letter that could have shaken everything, and those 2 words were still her. That's not something I will spend the rest of my life trying to replace. I moved into the house I bought in the spring. It's outside Columbus, smaller than I expected to start with a yard that is more work than I anticipated and a kitchen that needs updating and a view from the back window of a tree line that goes gold in October. I don't have a history here that I didn't choose. My father's card is still in my nightstand. I didn't bring much, but I brought that. There's a certain kind of family that holds you like open hands, present, supportive, not gripping. And then there's the kind that holds you like it's afraid of what you'll do if given the space to move. I spent a long time not being able to tell the difference because I had never felt the first kind clearly enough to compare. My father held on with open hands. I know that now in a way I couldn't fully articulate while he was alive. The paperwork proved it, but the paperwork was just the evidence. The thing itself had always been there. Have you ever been claimed by someone who had every reason not to? Not saved, claimed. Chosen, quietly, without announcement, over and over across 31 years. And have you ever found out about it too late to say thank you? I've thought a lot about the sequence of events that led to that conference room. Not obsessively, I'm not built for obsession, but the way you turn a problem over when you're trying to understand the actual mechanics of it. What caused what? What started where? Theo made a choice, sometime in the year after our father died, to contact the estate attorney without telling me. I don't think he woke up one morning and decided to be the villain of anything. I think he got scared, and when scared people don't have the integrity to sit with their fear, they start moving things around, trying to control outcomes before anyone else can. That's not evil. It's a failure of nerve. But failures of nerve have consequences, and those consequences landed exactly where they should have. Not because the universe punishes people, but because my father was paying attention and was smarter and more patient than anyone gave him credit for. Howard Aldridge watched. He listened. He filed paperwork. He amended a beneficiary designation quietly, without drama, without confronting anyone, and then he died. And everything he'd put in place held? That's not luck. That's what integrity looks like when it's been practiced for decades. It builds something durable, even after you're gone. What I keep coming back to, the thing that matters most to me personally, is that my father had the information that could have destabilized everything, and he chose to write 2 words in pencil and set it down. Still her. He didn't need a committee. He didn't need permission. He looked at what he knew and decided what it meant to him, and then he lived by that decision every single day afterward without ever once making me feel like a debt he was paying. That takes something. A kind of quiet moral clarity that most people never develop because it requires you to put someone else's well-being fully ahead of your own ego, over and over, across 31 years. I think about what it took to build a life the way I did, carefully, self-sufficiently, not leaning too hard on people who couldn't hold the weight. I used to think that was just my personality. Now I think some of it was training. When you grow up understanding early that approval is not guaranteed, you either collapse looking for it or you build something in yourself that doesn't require it. I chose to build. That was my own work. But having a father who modeled what it looked like to act from principle rather than from fear, that wasn't nothing. That shaped what I thought was possible. My mother made mistakes and has been honest about them, which is its own kind of courage. Honesty that comes late is still honesty. I'm not ready to call what we have now fully repaired, but I'm willing to keep showing up to it, which I think is how repair actually works. Not in one conversation, but in the accumulation of showing up anyway. Theo and I are figuring out something new. It's slower than I'd like and more necessary than I expected. The version of a sibling relationship we had before wasn't actually working. It was just stable in the way that unexamined things can seem stable until something pushes on them. What we're building now has more friction and more honesty, and I think, eventually, more value. I moved into my house in the spring. There are things here I chose: the tree line, the quiet, the kitchen I'm slowly updating on my own schedule. There are things I carried with me: a card in a nightstand drawer, 2 words written in pencil, the particular weight of being claimed by someone who never once made that claiming feel conditional. You don't always get to thank the people who shape you most. Sometimes the best you can do is understand it clearly, carry it forward, and try when it's your turn to do the same for someone else.